everyone.
Good morning.
It's such a pleasure to see you all here, despite the many weather challenges I know some of you folks encountered. It sounded like trains, planes, and automobiles got us here. But we're thrilled to have you with us this morning. Whenever we hold a convening, we are somewhat surprised that people show up to our equity party. So it's just really a pleasure and a privilege to be here and to see your smiling faces this morning. So thank you for joining us. We're going to begin with an invocation from Dr. Doreen Weesey, who is founding president of the American Indian Association of Illinois and has over 50 years of experience as a Chicago American Indian activist, educator, and community health advocate. Weesey was appointed as the first American Indian on the Cook County Hospital and Health Systems Board, and she's the first American Indian to receive a doctorate degree from Northern Illinois University in Leadership and Policy Studies. She has served as a lifetime education and health advocate for the most vulnerable communities, including immigrants and refugees, and recently received the 2019 Bright Promises Foundation Award for her work. She is an enrolled member of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe White Earth Mississippi Band. Thank you, and please help me welcome Dr. Doreen Weesey.
Bonjour, Anin. Good morning. I greeted you in Ojibwe, and so now you all know some native words. Part of my challenge today is to give the land acknowledgement. How many of you have ever heard a land acknowledgement? All right, everybody here, that's great. So happy. So I'm going to begin there. And today we stand on the ancient, present, and future land of over 1 million American Indian people who have called Chicago home, from the treaty periods of the Council of the Three Fires, who were the Ojibwe, which is my tribe, of Potawatomi and Odawa. From the earlier times of the Illinois Confederacy, the Miami, the Kickapoo, the Sauk, the Fox, and many other tribes who lost their lives to disease, warfare, starvation, and removal. All of these native people were forced from this land by 1833. By the Treaty of Chicago, which moved all native people west of the Mississippi. But American Indian people from over 100 tribes have returned and now number over 100,000 in the state of Illinois. Their names are still the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, and new tribal members from tribes like the Cherokee, the Navajo, the Dakota, the Lakota, Oneida, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiians, who now call Chicago home. These tribal members and their tribes all have a unique legal relationship to the United States government and to all of you. Our histories are threaded together like this sweetgrass braid. You cannot have one without the other. Like the blessed water you will drink today, and that is all around you in this great lake, Lake Michigan. Like the air we breathe and the plant and animal brothers and sisters who give us their lives to feed us, all granted us by the Great Spirit, Gishimanadu. The natural world existed thousands of years before these tall buildings, L trains, buses, and cars. Our natural world on Mother Earth, who sustains us, is your natural world too. Together we are charged to live in balance, to see one another as relatives, and be all part of the great web of life. We just ask as Native people to be seen as part of the great web and included in your efforts, for it is here we live, work, and create alongside you. Include our data, include our elders, include our youth, include our art, music, poetry, and dance, and you will help balance the sacred world we all live in and bring forward the true and total truth, healing, restoration, and equity. Many of our elders have died alone, waiting for someone to seek their knowledge. Together we can see that knowledge is not lost. Miigwech for listening and inviting me here. It has been an honor. Now I'd like to read a poem for you, and it's about how Chicago is sacred space. Chicago space has been made sacred by our people, made sacred by the joy of Ho-Chunk, Zuni, Lakota, Ponca, Ojibwe drums and songs, made sacred by weddings, birthdays, funerals, and ceremonies of all kinds, made sacred by the all-night prayers and the tying of the water drums, made sacred by the traditional ghost feast honoring our elders, made sacred by the Native American Church, the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, the Episcopal Church, the Methodist services, made sacred by holy pipes smoked and tobacco laid, made sacred by the prayers of our elders in languages much older than Chicago, made sacred by the tears of homeless who sat on those tall steps and shared a cigarette or two, made sacred by the gifts given of Pendletons, eagle feathers, honor songs, and blessings, made sacred by babies who danced their first dance wrapped in the arms of strong Native women, made sacred by the workers who greeted newcomers, cleaned stairways and washed dishes, made sacred by elders who sat at the head elder table smiling on the red road, made sacred by grandmothers and grandfathers who made a way for all of us, made sacred by Indian names given and received, made sacred by the planting of the Creator's gifts, corns, beans, squash, and gardens of all kinds, made sacred by Indians who cooked, carried water, and blessed the meals, made sacred by young people who fell in love, danced the two-step, and laughed on Saturday nights, made sacred by thousands of volunteers who blessed us with their love, made sacred by the words spoken, awards received, and plans made for educated futures, made sacred by the coffee, water, and jokes we shared, made sacred by the presence of millions of our ancestors that held us up, made sacred before, now, and forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weesey. And in follow-up, after today's events are over, we will send you a toolkit that was curated by one of our colleagues, Vance Blackfox, which has some recommendations on how to do a land acknowledgement at your event, as well as a host of other resources on Native communities and culture. And we would invite you or encourage you to participate in the afternoon session, the blanket exercise, which is going to be co-facilitated by Vance Blackfox and Prairie Rose Seminole. And it's an experiential exercise on the history and the present of Native people in this country. So thank you for starting us off in a good way, Dr. Weesey. And I'm Karen Rollins Suarez. I'm the Executive Director of Equity in the Center. I realize I didn't introduce myself before. So welcome again, and I have a few housekeeping items before we start the morning plenary. First, I want to thank Independent Sector and Upswell for partnering with us and allowing us to host this convening the day before their big show. They've been great partners, and literally there would be nothing in this room if not for them. But I also want to give a huge and tremendous shout out to Anna Daniels, who is Equity in the Center's event planner, and nothing would have happened without Anna. So if you have a home, if you eat, if you have a chair to sit in, Anna is responsible for that. So if you see her, please say thank you, and I want to extend my heartfelt thanks for her partnership and commitment to our work. One notice is some of you may have seen the iPad in the middle of the floor. So we are live streaming this session, and we'll also live stream the lunch plenary as well as one of the concurrent sessions. So if you're in the vicinity of the iPad, we just ask that you be aware that your conversations can be heard, and just keep that in mind as you offer commentary to your neighbor. Just to give you some logistical updates on the agenda, we are currently, because this is a very large hotel and I've already been lost, in the Salon A area of the hotel in the lower lobby. We will be back in this room for the lunch plenary. But there are a couple of changes to the locations for some of the other sessions. So after the morning plenary, there'll be morning sessions from 11:15 to 12:45. The Racial Healing Circle, the RX Racial Healing Circle, for which many of you pre-registered, will be held on the 3rd floor in the Wilford Room. There was a Google form distributed for you to complete a demographic survey so you could be paired in a conversation dyad for that exercise. There are 5 remaining spots. So after the plenary, we have a feeling many of you will be interested in participating in the RX Racial Healing Circle, the introduction to the process that Dr. Christopher will talk about. So the first 5 people who did not complete the Google form that get to Wilford A will be able to participate, even if you didn't complete the form. So that is on the 3rd floor. Building a race equity culture in nonprofit and philanthropic organizations will be in Salon A4, which is just outside the store. On your agenda, it says it's going to be in room A2. So we just wanted to correct that. It's in A4. And Beyond Commitment, 4 Steps to Get Started on Building a Race Equity Culture is still in the same room, Salon A3. We'll be back in here for lunch. The blanket exercise is in the Buckingham room, which is on the lobby level, so you have to go back upstairs, come out of the elevators and go around to the right. There will be volunteers to help you find your way. The Buckingham room is under the escalator. One change is that the white allyship training, which is after lunch, will be in Salon A4, not A2, as is listed on the agenda. And what would an equity consultant do will still be in Salon A3. And we can remind you all of this again later in the day as we go through, but we just wanted to touch on that and let you know that the final reception, the ending for our day, during which there will be 2 exciting Ignite talks from a couple of our colleagues talking about new resources, will be in the Grand Traditions room on the lower level. And if you have any questions, please stop by our registration desk or ask a volunteer. So with that, I will turn it over to Jose Rico, who is the Director of Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, Greater Chicago, to introduce our plenary speakers.
Buenos dias. Good morning, buenos dias. Welcome to Chicago. So for those of you that don't spend a lot of time here, now you know why Chicagoans have character, because this is the type of weather that builds that type of character. And if some of you are not used to this type of weather and feel a little down and bluesy about it, there's a spot right on Wabash that could take care of you, a blues bar that I highly recommend. My name is Jose Rico. I am the son of Tomasa and Nicolás, Guadalupe and Lupe, the grandson of Celia and Carlos, and the father to Tizoc, Amaya, and Amaru. And I want to welcome you all as a director of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation of Greater Chicago. And I would love for any of the members who participated as the racial healing practitioners, volunteers, and participants for the TRHT Chicago to please raise your hand. So welcome from all of the folks here that are doing this work. Our mission is to engage and liberate our people through creating brave spaces so we can repair the trauma of racial injustice. And we do this by building a multi-layered racial justice agenda. And today I am so honored to present 2 incredible speakers that are going to lead us in how we do this, their experience, and the steps that we need to take forward. So I'm so honored to introduce Dr. Gail Christopher, the visionary and architect of this work, and we'd love to be able to welcome Dr. Gail Christopher to come up here. And also honored to introduce Brother Marcus Walton, a true relationship builder and a transformational leader of this work, somebody who's my path and his have recently crossed, and now I know that we are linked forever. So Marcus, if you please come up here. And looking forward to have this conversation with y'all. We will be here all day, and if anybody from Chicago is interested in the work of TRHT Chicago, please see myself or Pilar Reed, who is also in the room. Okay?
This way we don't have to share and be awkward. I'm an only child, which some of you know. But I feel everyone should have their own microphone. Good morning again, and thank you to you both for joining us. And each of you, when you speak, may need to turn it on, because I know I did when I got up here. I and Equity in the Center are so excited to have this conversation today. When we partnered with Upswell to have the day's, thank you, convening, we were thinking about how we wanted to start the day. And racial healing has been at the forefront of our minds because earlier this year, Andrew and I had the privilege of participating in an RX racial healing facilitators training that Dr. Christopher led. And since then, we've been talking a lot to our colleagues as well as within our team about the significance of racial healing to operationalizing equity inside of organizations. Marcus and I have talked about this a lot. The word messy is used to describe this work and the feelings that arise as part of it. And racial healing is a process, a protocol that can be utilized to help people process those feelings as part of an intentional process to operationalize equity or build a race equity culture, as we say, inside of organizations. So to get us started, we'd like Dr. Christopher first to share a little context on the history of racial healing, after which Marcus will share his perspective on the work and how it connects to what he's been doing.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the invitation. I am honored and privileged, and I have to say that coming here gave me an opportunity to spend some time with my first grandchild, so I am extremely filled with joy and happiness. I want to begin, first of all, by thanking the Chicago leadership and clarifying that the truth, racial healing, and transformation concept is, I don't like the word inclusive because it comes from a sort of a hierarchy perspective in the sense that it's mine and I'm going to include you in it. I like to use the term expansive, which is the term that those Native American elders and partners who worked with us over the years in developing this work, they taught us that the circle as a symbol within indigenous culture is expansive. And so I want to be clear that the intention of the truth, racial healing, and transformation work has always been to honor that expansive concept, expansive and inclusive, and engage all people. Now, we all see the world through our own lens, and so even though we created a certain type of framework for this work, there are many places around the country where only a few groups have been represented in the work, and we would say, no, you have to reach out to all the demographic populations in your community. Sometimes we get the response, well, we don't know those people. Duh, that's the point. Get to know, reach out, find that. So I just want to make clear that the design of the work has always been to embrace all people because all people have suffered from the fallacy of a hierarchy of human value. It is that hierarchy, that fallacy, that antiquated belief system, first promulgated by the Catholic Church in the Papal Bulls, which said, okay, you can come to the New Worlds and you can take those lands and you can destroy those people. That was back in the 14th century, 1400s, 1500s. But then it was codified into biological and botanical law in the 18th century, in the 1700s, by Linnaeus, a botanist, who gave us these taxonomies that we live with today. And we still live with them in science, we live with them in plant kingdoms, etc. But that same idea of creating a taxonomy of the human family based on geography, primarily based on physical characteristics, and then ascribed character traits that were used to justify that we can take and we can destroy because you are less than. So I want to be clear that the hierarchy of human value, a belief system, undergirds colonization, it undergirds enslavement, it undergirds decimation of indigenous people, and our belief is that you have to get rid of that fundamental undergirding permission. We can keep tinkering around the edges, we can keep passing laws and litigation and fighting for justice, but if the individual and collective consciousness is still guided by that deeply internalized false belief that some people are more valuable than others, that belief will continue to outpicture itself as in our current administration in Washington, D.C. That belief system of supremacy has found its way back into authority and power in ways that we might never have imagined it could in the 21st century. So that's why when we say racial healing, we're focusing on eradicating the belief system itself, which is the underlying permission, and helping people through that process so that they can show up for creating equity and fairness and justice. So I wanted to just lay that out, and you'll have to stop me because I don't have a timer keeper in front of me. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the history of this work. There's been this notion of healing from racism and race relations work that's been around a very long time. This particular work is not that. It's not healing from racism, nor is it race relations work. Both the race relations era kind of grew out of, in many ways, academic sociology and still push concepts of tolerance. And you know, tolerance is a supremacy concept. You know, I'm gonna tolerate you. You know, you are less than me, but I'm gonna tolerate your presence, right? Now, some people will argue with that, but that's the way my experience has interpreted that concept of tolerance. The movement for healing of racism, a laudable, important, powerful movement in this country, the subject was racism, and the modifier was healing. In this work, which is racial healing, the subject is healing, and the modifier is racial. There's a difference. Now, why do we say RX or prescription racial healing? I say that because the ultimate consequence of exposure to racial hierarchy and to discrimination, it lives in our bodies. And it makes us sick. Now, I say I'm a Chicago native in the sense that I lived here for 25 years, and I learned my practice of holistic health here, and saw thousands of patients. And I realized that it was the stress of exposure, not only to discrimination, but to the structural inequities that creates our vulnerability to all manner of disease. And so, you know, we can have affordable health care, we can have Medicare for all, we can do all these things, but if we don't stop believing and acting out the belief in a hierarchy of human value, my dad used to say, don't go fattening frogs for snakes, girl. We'll keep feeding the machine that profits off of our illness and disability. So we can unpack that, but the reason we say prescription or RX racial healing is to give a recommendation with authority that it is time for us to jettison the fallacy of a hierarchy of human value and embrace all of us, all of our brothers and sisters, and perhaps most importantly, all of our children and grandchildren, to embrace them equally with love as our ancestors embraced us. So I'll stop there, and then I'll turn it over to Marcus, and we'll have a chance to interact.
So you should just drop the mic completely. Thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you. For many of you who don't know, I'm Marcus Walton. I'm the president and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. And that's just a role that I hold in many roles. I also support Surge Institute here. I see a couple of my family out here, hands to the roof. Lots of movement-based change work, particularly amongst those of us who have been fighting against the very thing that Dr. Christopher just described in terms of the systems and structures that have persisted against various communities from the beginning. That was brilliant because perhaps for the first time, and I've grown up a student and admirer of Dr. Christopher, so this is just a surreal moment, just for that reason. But for the first time, I heard a historical analysis that nails my personal experience and the experiences of those who I've had the privilege and pleasure of supporting through all types of different work, whether it's been as a grant maker, Borealis Philanthropy, or Cleveland Foundation, or through affinity group connections such as ADFI and others, Change Philanthropy. But now it feels like a different day. And it's something in what you said about, I kept hearing ancestors, I kept hearing connections to culture when Dr. Weesey offered the invocation. And so you may have even seen some posturing, some breathing. There's a couple of things that came to me in terms of, okay, what do you do in this moment? Because I'm up here representing a bunch of people. I just named a couple of those groups. It's not just about Marcus, but this is about how do we make the most of each moment? So I'm going to offer a framework connected to what Dr. Christopher shared, but it's about how do we operationalize the things that we're talking about. And I'll offer it with a twist. I love that we have a little contrast here, right? Wisdom, testing and learning, but building upon the wisdom of those before us is a theme that I'd like you to consider. I'd like to connect you in this moment and invite you to consider your purpose for being here. Like, what's the real driver? You did not have to be here, especially in this weather, travel challenges. How many of you travel from out of town in some way or another? All right, a lot of hands. Me too. First flight was canceled yesterday. How many of you experienced any kind of microaggressions along the way? All right. So this morning, 2 times someone asked me to get a cab for them in my hotel. Right? Twice. It's kind of a compliment, though. But I say that to point out the kind of paradox in this experience and to invite you to just hold that. That's okay. Not something that we tolerate or accept as approve of, but acknowledge that, you know what, there's going to be this kind of a dissonance. Sometimes I'm not going to be able to figure out what's happening to me. If we can move in the direction of being able to hold those experiences, then we're moving in the direction of being able to practice racial equity in a way that aligns with what Dr. Christopher just described. Offer that to you. All right. And I have a commitment to the people who make this possible for me. So what I mean by that is, as president and CEO of one of the larger membership associations in philanthropy, serving philanthropy, there are those who said, all right, like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do now? And I would not personally feel like this was possible unless I was thinking in terms of a we. The we language for me is connected to my heritage, a culture that says I am not me without you. I don't even have a clue of who I am and what's possible without you having a clue of who you are and what's possible. So without an us approach to this work, I could not imagine and envision what's possible from this platform. I'm here to make that invitation for you. You're just some friends. Some of you are friends that I do know. Many of you are just friends that I haven't met yet. And it's our opportunity to explore together. What's possible? Like, what is it that brings us here? Like, I want to invite a little more mystique into how we interact as human beings again. When, as social and political social nets tend to deteriorate, right? More and more we hear about division, but where's community? So in thinking about this, and I'm just going to be very short so we get into the conversation. If you think about all of this, I want you to also think about the context. So historically, we heard a great, I love how he took us so far back and brought us all the way here. I'm gonna go back halfway there and recall a conversation with some colleagues who said, all right, what are we gonna do? And thinking about that, it occurred to me that in no point in modern history, for me, African American, has there been a community of choice? Have Black communities organized around choice? It's always been in response, making the most of a situation. That's amazing. How do we talk about community if we never even experienced it before, ever? In this modern era. Not to say that historically it has never happened. We go back far enough, everything has happened. And it's happening over and over again, right? So what I love is the idea of this matrix. That's what came to mind. The other day, this weekend, with my family, we watched The Matrix. My son, 14 years old, watched all three. I was just like, oh my gosh. Now he'll understand some of the things I've been talking about for years. But I offer you The Matrix in the context of what you just heard from Dr. Christopher. We're going to build upon this. If we see the context in which we're operating, especially about leading change within a racial equity framework, as breaking free of the matrix, then how do we live into that?
So much brilliance from you both. Thank you. So it's a privilege to be up here and to listen to and learn from you. So thank you for sharing your opening thoughts, and I learned a lot, and I think other folks did too. At Equity in the Center, we talk about a way to work, building a race equity culture. So ultimately, we're all here today to learn more about that practice. So if we're a leader in an organization, whether we're the CEO or we play another role, even the most junior member of the staff, what are practices and tactics that we can put into place to measurably and meaningfully shift culture to center race equity? And Marcus, as you were talking about operating within a matrix, it resonated with how we as a team, I guess, think about building a race equity culture, because it's a deepening of practice. So the race equity cycle is a circle, and you move from awake to woke to work. But within each of those stages of the cycle, you have to think about the 4 levels on which racism operates. So internal or personal, as we sometimes call it, internalized, institutional, and structural. And considering, as Dr. Christopher shared, how the hierarchy of human value undergirds every choice that we make in our life and in our work. So much of building a race equity culture is about a deepening of our own sense of awareness of how the hierarchy of human value is guiding our implicit and sometimes explicit choices about who is capable and credible to lead, who is dressed the right way to hold a certain job, who is capable and credible to steward resources. And I invite you, as Marcus and Dr. Christopher did, to consider how that hierarchy of human value shows up in your life and in your work. And challenge us all, as we are each on our journey, to explore racial healing as a strategy to achieve that as part of operationalizing equity. So my question for you two brilliant folks is, how does operationalizing equity and building a race equity culture, as we say, fit into the TRHT framework?
Thank you so much. There's so much happening, so much brilliance and excitement here. I should probably start by describing the TRHT framework and giving honor and respect and appreciation to the Kellogg Foundation and the 40 other foundations around the country that stepped up within local communities to support this journey, this work. The framework it begins with, as our lives do, with the narrative, right? He who controls the narrative tends to control the story, and the story is what motivates us, right? And so the top of the framework is narrative change. We used, at one point in the evolution of the work, we called it reclaiming the narrative, right? Learning to tell true stories, stories that honor all of our experiences and not just the trauma. I want to say to this audience, and I'm saying it to every audience I speak with, we are more than our traumas. We are so much more than our traumas. I'm not saying don't pay attention to the traumas, don't heal from the traumas, but we cannot allow the trauma to be our definition. We have to create a narrative that embodies respect for the continuum of our existence and the existence of our ancestors and the future. So narrative change is important. It's critically important today because the hierarchy of human value as a concept really gained traction historically during the time that the printing press evolved or became known, and so those lies could be spread, right? It was called the first information revolution. But we're in the midst of the second information revolution right now, and if we don't step up and grab a hold of this thing, the algorithms that are going to dictate our lives are still going to embody the same fallacies of a hierarchy of human value. We could go into depth on that. But the narrative today is probably more critical than it's ever been because more so than ever before, at least in a very tangible, technology-driven way, narratives are in fact driving our choices in ways that are immediate. And I think the biggest difference is the speed with which those narratives take hold. And so I just want to put that out there to this brilliant audience. You all can figure out what to do about that. I don't know. So the first phase of the piece of the framework is narrative change. The second is where I live, which is called racial healing. It has to do with relationships. And particularly in a society that's structured on hierarchy, doors open and opportunities emerge through trusted relationships. Yes. Coalitions are built through trusted relationships. So this idea of expanding and enhancing our relationship capital, I'll use that word, that's where we live, right? But our strength of relationships is critical to galvanizing the sheer numbers that we need in order to have a majority in a democracy. And ultimately, in a democracy, we need a majority. So for those who are advocates who want to say we don't need racial healing, we just need, advocacy and policy change and practice change and resource change, ultimately in a democracy, you got to have people who can vote that in because that's how we got here, partially. So the racial healing work operationally is at the core of building the constituency to sustain the change. Once we do the narrative change work and the racial healing and expanding our circle work, then we step back and ask, so if racial hierarchy is a lie, how has it been sustained for centuries, right? We're celebrating the 400th anniversary of slavery, but this racial hierarchy predates that by 400 years before that. So it's been sustained by separation, and separation is so cruel. Separation from family, separation from native lands, separation from one another, separation into solitary confinement, Rikers Island, separation in the child welfare system. I mean, we can go on and on. I get goosebumps as I describe it because separation is the tool of oppression and maintaining the racial hierarchy. So separation is the other piece of the framework. And then It's a 5-part framework. The second piece of that answer to the question, how has the hierarchy been sustained, is through our legal system. Make no mistake about it. The legal system, the rule of law in this country was based primarily on maintaining not only white supremacy, but the right to own and enslave people. If you go back into our history, the Constitution itself, the Declaration of Independence, was mired in those beliefs in a hierarchy of human value. And when some folks tried to stand up and protest, they were shot down because the profit motive would be disrupted if they built into our founding documents a truth of human equality. So the law, both the legal criminal system and the civil legal system, it was a tool for maintaining this hierarchy. And then finally, and this is where folks get real skittish, the economy. Now, you know, all this talk about reparations now, and folks are running in some ways saying, well, we could never do that. We could never pay back. We could never, you know, finance the redress of the grievances, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, the system of hierarchy is an economic system. It allows for exploitation of people in its many different iterations. So I had to lay out the TRHT framework before I could answer the question. And I think the way that we operationalize the racial healing within that context is we have methodologies for expanding our circles of engagement, compassionate engagement, so that we all show up to do the work. And we create a value system within our organizations, within our communities, within our universities, where we're not more woke than the next person. We understand that we all have been hoodwinked by this fallacy, and we are willing to partner with one another in the journey. And it is a journey. You all, some of you have heard me speak, you know, I tell lots of personal stories. We don't have time for that today. But we all hold bias. We just do, because we were raised to have that, right? And so each day we're growing in our capacity to overcome our biases. And it was really Albert Einstein's quote, although I'm sure he took it from somebody else, but
I'm sure.
our ability to see ourselves in the face of the other. That's what we have to develop. I have to be able to see and look into your eyes and see myself reflected there, and be able to extend compassion and love to you versus projecting hatred and fear. Because you're either doing one or the other.
Mm.
So I'm going to stop there. Mark?
You hear how sweet and gently she did that? Marcus, I'm going to attempt to follow that. I appreciate the mention of compassionate engagement, because some of us are in pain. We've experienced trauma that's very real. It ought not be diminished or trivialized. It doesn't matter what other people think about that experience. If we experience it as trauma, that's what it is to us, to the individual, right? So again, I encourage you to hold the paradox. That doesn't seem like this to me when someone else is saying it. This is like this to them. I'm saying, let's build the muscle of holding both as valid expressions, okay? I also want to challenge us, because the conversation was just elevated. I don't know if you saw it or felt it, but I felt the tingling when you felt it. We're talking about community. We're talking about being relational. I'll add some components to what I just heard. In order to be a practitioner, to operationalize what we're referring to, this healing, first we need to be clear about our language, what we mean, because of these paradoxes that are constantly being held. I'm offering healing as a return to our original state of being, unadulterated. Right? As many people have reinterpreted the ancient philosophies such as Einstein and seeing ourselves in others. The ancient ancestors that I have learned from have said, know thyself. It's on the pyramids, on those big old buildings in Egypt, which is in Africa. I'm just saying, sometimes in America we can be a little ahistorical, not understand geography as well. Knowing thyself is what we're actually talking about. I'm inviting us to reclaim the history that is ours. Now when I say ours, what do I mean by that? I mean, there's one race. And now we're digging into the social and political constructs now. I offer that there's one race, and that's the human race. And that many different forms of separation, as Dr. Christopher said, have created these false dichotomies. And that this structure, Western society, upholds and perpetuates false dichotomies of separation. And it's in our language, either or, right? One or the other, false choice. Right? Independent, individual, bootstraps. Who made the boots? What if you don't have boots yet? How do you get a pair of boots? Right? All these things, what I'm doing is challenging the premise and encouraging you to do so. But guess what? The institutions that we have gone through for more than a decade from birth encourage us to think a particular kind of way. So you already have been indoctrinated. We all have. So part of this is an undoing to get back to our original unadulterated state. Right? That's my interpretation of heal. Okay? How do we do that? Let's go back to the Matrix. Has anyone not seen the Matrix? Anyone not heard of the Matrix? Okay. So there's this red pill, blue pill. Now, mind you, there's no third option. I just talked about the false dichotomies, right? So, like, this is getting a little deep. I want to challenge you to see yourself as Neo. You are each the one. But you're actually a part of the whole. You're part of the one. It's not you, but it's what you represent as your individual expression of something bigger than yourself. That is a cultural interpretation of how to experience life on a day-to-day basis that I have adopted and practiced as a part of my racial equity journey. My invitation is for you to find the meaning through your own cultural connection, to be able to express it through your living for yourself. And do so using the framework that Dr. Christopher introduced, which is relationally. Equity in the center could be relationships in the center. People in the center. People over objects. People over things. Right? The final challenge for this portion is to consider using your imagination not to figure out, but to consider what it means to be aspirational in each moment. What do I mean by that? I mean that the same political and social structures that have informed our socialization have encouraged us to get the right answers, to the point where we identify ourselves with our capacity to know. If I don't know a thing, I feel insecure. I feel less than the person who knows more in that area. That is a macro aggression. There's nothing micro about that. Your self-worth is not connected to what you know. It's who you are. But your practice doesn't reflect an awareness of who you are. So you show up in spaces practicing being the one that knows the most. Performing. Racial equity practice in the way that I'm offering it to you, inviting you into this community, is not performative. It is authentic. It's based on your truest expression of self, and it requires a lot of undoing, decluttering of thoughts, unpacking of how you've been socialized and how you in particular are expressing it as an individual in the context of how this structure is reinforcing all of these false notions, i.e. the matrix. Right? So by introducing the aspirational, we allow ourselves to rise above what we've been told is possible through the limited parameters defined by the narratives inside of the system, historically and socially. We each have a cultural connection that offers rich resources to inform how we do that. But we have to be comfortable entering into the unknown in order to experience the expansion that we've been talking about. And it's through that experience that I offer something different in our racial equity practice. So leading change, for me, has been reconnected to culture, living it, identifying the principles, breathing into it, releasing those social constructs, those political constructs that did not serve me in any other capacity except to serve the system, and replacing them with those that reinforce interconnectedness with other people, other human beings, and keeping that at the center regardless of anything that we do, any transaction, any interaction. Our quality of connection and well-being is what's primary.
Thank you. Thank you both for elevating us. And I have a challenge for the group, which will take us from aspirational to tactical. Because at Equity in the Center, I feel like we always revert back to sharing resources and tools, which are not as important as what these two brilliant folks have just shared. But as we deepen our practice, if we are trying to unlearn that in which we have been steeped, we're trying to create a reality that we actually don't know how to sustain.
That's right.
We talk about equity, we talk about freedom, we talk about liberation, and in our dominant culture, which we share regardless of our ethnicity or particular cultural background, we actually don't know how to do that because, to Dr. Christopher's point about the founding of this particular nation, that was not the point. So we don't know how to live free, we do not know how to maintain equity as a people, because that was never the point of this particular country. But colonialism is global, so we'll just talk about America today. So I'm going to ask Dr. Christopher to share a prompt for those in the room to practice the relational piece of the work that she and Marcus have been talking about. And then after that, I was thinking we could take some questions to get folks, you to respond to what they're interested in.
So I just want to be clear, do we want them to take a moment and?
Yes, to do it, just so that you can
little
practice
taste. Okay, all right.
what Dr. Christopher has been talking about, and also practice what Marcus has shared he works on and practices daily. If you feel there's a brief one they could try for a few minutes in pairs.
So, and prompts are just designed to create a framework, if you will, for sharing a story. And story is our window into, or avenue into, a deeper connection to another human being. So I'm going to suggest that you just think of a time in your life when you needed to be heard and you were heard, and what that experience meant for you in terms of how you felt in that moment of being heard and affirmed, and what that experience meant for you, or the implications of it in your life. Now, only take, like, we're going to give 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. 5 minutes, find a partner, someone who's at your table or not, and just take a moment, if you will, and share a story about a moment when you needed to be heard, a brief story, and you were heard. It's just a prompt inviting you into a conversation with someone else in this moment. So, you are willing to do that?
Yes.
All right, let's do that. Who's got the time?
Thanks. I have a timer, and if you could just do this in pairs or a trio at your table, depending upon how many of them you are, and I'll give you a warning at the halfway mark.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Hi, we're at about the halfway mark, 2.5 minutes left. hear lots of storytelling. I see a hug happening. I feel like this was a good beat for us to take. Andrew has turned on the mic in the center of the room. So first of all, I want to thank each of you for participating and engaging in the storytelling exercise with your neighbor. But what we'd like to do now is hear from all of you, or some of you. So there is a mic in the center of the room in front of the iPad, and we invite those of you who have questions for our experts to come up and to share. And perhaps you have a reflection on the prompt exercise, but since we've been talking for a while, we want to make sure that we pause after this sort of grounding conversation you've had with your table mates to hear from you in the room and make sure that we're addressing your your pressing questions before we transition to talking about this work a bit more tactically. So how do you weave it into the operationalization of equity inside of an organization? When do you introduce it? Are there particular inflection points at which it is helpful? How do you bring people into the process in a way that will advance building a race equity culture? So, who has a comment or a question for the panel? Oh, you guys were very talkative, not 30 seconds ago. If not, we can keep going. I have a list of questions. Oh, please, if you have a question, please come to the mic in the center of the room.
I'll come bring it to you.
Good morning, good morning. Really very grateful for inspiring us to continue to dismantle, interrupt, reimagine, how to really remove this hierarchy of human value that we
Can you
exist
share your
under.
name?
Oh, I'm sorry. Rito Martinez here from Chicago. So again, thank you so much for really giving us some inspiration around the dismantling, interruption, and reimagining of this hierarchy of human value that exists all around us. My question is, what do we begin to rename a new structure
Good for you.
for how to move forward from this point forward? We know what it is that we want to disrupt, reimagine, but we also need to name and envision a new structure and name that powerfully for ourselves.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, and I want to answer it on two levels. First of all, I believe all things stem from consciousness, which is why I focus on the belief. And if we have to jettison, I'm a Star Trek fan, so you know when they jettison something, you know it's gone, right? So as we jettison the fallacy of a hierarchy of human value, we replace it with the remembered knowing of our sacred interconnectedness with a shared human ancestry. Now, the genomic science...
We both believe this stuff. This is unbelievable.
And we just met today. But you see, there are no accidents. And that's the other thing I just want to get this in real quick. You talked about knowing, and in the Western ideology, knowing is, you know, what somebody else wrote down, you know, and then you credit them with having written it down and you internalize it and you know it, right? But in many indigenous cultures, there are different ways of knowing. And part of our work is to honor the different ways of knowing. And those ways of knowing are revealed to us through our connection, not only with one another, but with nature itself, with all forms of life. And so receiving impressions intuitively, being guided by wisdom that we don't even know where it came from. If you haven't seen it, please see the movie Harriet. Harriet had a different way of knowing, but that way of knowing saved the lives of so many. So in addition to knowing, there are ways of knowing that need to be honored. But so first we have to replace the belief in a hierarchy of human value with the truth of our shared sacred interconnectedness as an expansive human family. The genomic science would tell us now that we all trace our ancestry back to a woman in Africa that the geneticists call mitochondrial Eve. And mitochondrial Eve is named because we transfer our health genomes or genes through the mother. Now there are different origin stories that every culture has, but I respect those, but you know, science kind of says there's a lot of migration out of Africa, and that's where it really all began. Now, once you understand and believe that we are of a shared family, human ancestry, Then we have to ask, how do we translate that into our work, right? And so in the designing of TRHT, the first thing we do is ask people to have a vision for what will your organization, what will your community, what will this nation be like when we have truly replaced this hierarchy of human value with a foundational belief in our sacred interconnectedness as a human family. How does that show up? And those who've done this work have written some powerful vision statements nationally. And our Native Americans who were on the team, they used the 7-generation metaphor, you know, and they said, what will life be like for my children's 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 children? You know, I mean, how will they live? What will society afford them when it is no longer grounded in this notion of a human value hierarchy? Each community must go through that work. You must ask yourselves, what is my organization? How will it function? What experience will people have if we're not adhering to the fallacy of a hierarchy of human value? That doesn't mean you're going to throw out your current operational system tomorrow, but it is a vision for a future which requires progress toward that future. So I thank you for that question, and that is one of the first steps. But ultimately, we are replacing the fallacy with the truth that we are connected, and therefore what I do to you has something to do with what happens to me as well.
Wow. I want to encourage everyone to take advantage of this Q&A. I'm telling you, this is a rare and special opportunity. I'll briefly add to that naming itself is cultural. Right? The voice I'm offering for your consideration, that the voice is an expression of our inherent power to create. So when we don't use it, we are sabotaging ourselves. The system reinforces self-censorship in ways that doesn't require an external party to sabotage you. We experience it as all of the isms and the aggressions that cut across intersectional identities. An antidote to self-sabotage is connecting to our voice, which means being honest about how we feel and actually expressing it through art, through writing, through a conversation, inside of your head. But here's the thing. The cultural expression of all of this that goes back to that ancient wisdom we're talking about says that you're more than just your thoughts. We have to get out of just this part of our bodies and into the whole thing. Right? Authentic expression helps us reclaim those aspects of ourselves that lie dormant as a result of these structures, these isms. Okay? So, a practice that I offer to you, and I'm literally introducing the concept of individual practice as a part of this racial healing journey. Breathe. Sounds simple. Breathing helps ground you in the current moment. When your thoughts go this way, your emotions go that way because of a thing, oh my goodness, you're just triggered. Find your breath, it anchors you, it brings you back. We want to get into the habit of returning back to center. You see how I did that? Equity in the center. People and relationships, self, well-being. The reason being in community is important is because people around us can hold us accountable based upon the agreements that we make. So when you hear me express myself authentically, you can see me when I act the way that's outside of that and say, Marcus, but you just said that. That's holding us accountable with all the tenderness and like we're holding us to the highest expression of who we really are. You won't let me go too far outside of my own intentions, even though I'm guaranteed to fall short of my own expectations. Did you hear that? Guaranteed to fall short of our own expectations for ourselves. So when you interact with someone else, you're not only interacting with them, but you're interacting with a set of disappointments that they hold against themselves because they fell short of their own aspirations. And on a regular basis, and sometimes over years. So being in community allows us to lessen the tension, the weight and burden of that story that's running through our heads over and over again. We create a space. Dr. Weesey talked about sacred space. Mm-hmm. Community is the sacred space where you can just show up as you are. You can take a breath. And that practice brings us back to center. It helps us get closer to that original, unadulterated state of who we actually are. Allows us to express our voice unfettered and reconnects us to be expansive.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Makia Moody, and I'm wondering if you can offer some wisdom related to, you've said that relationships are like the accelerant, the lubricant, how to expand the circle. But thinking about organizations where there are power dynamics and tripwires, what do you suggest when maybe that relationship development is, I guess, there's barriers to it based on the power dynamics within the organization, or you showing up as your authentic self is a little too much, a little too extra? Like, how do you, what advice could you offer for that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question. The methodology that we recommend, and some of you will experience it today, is to create circles. Circles are designated experiences, if you will, where you bring diverse folks together and go through a process that's been designed to foster capacity for empathy and understanding, to model the process of reducing stress and authentically engaging. And if you can, ideally, have those experiences within your organization as part of the cultural journey, you then sort of get to know each other. Now, when we've done this with thousands of people around the country, and I remember the first time I said we were going to do it at the Kellogg Foundation, people were like, you're not going to have that PhD in the same room with that community activist or that CEO, and then on and on and on and on. And I said, no, they're going to leave their hats outside the door. When we come into the circle, we come into the circle as people, as equal people. And we reinforce that moment because we're making eye contact with one another. We're sitting in between two people, so we are surrounded, if you will, and we are engaged compassionately. And the circle process is co-facilitated, always co-facilitated, because we are modeling that it is possible for two very different people to be engaged productively. And then you get to know each other, and you let go of some of the defenses. Now, I'm not trying to say this is a panacea. I am saying that it is a rare opportunity to bring people together, to take off the mask. You remember that poem, We Wear the Mask, right?
Nice to hear.
But so we can take off the mask for a time, and we can begin to cultivate more of a sense of seeing ourselves in the face of the other, so that when the challenge comes, there is this sort of avenue, if you will, to travel, to reach out, or to really listen. We have two ears and one mouth, but we tend to have it in reverse, right? And we don't listen to one another. We don't hear one another. So I really recommend, and also pairing, connecting is a part of the methodology. In the RX Racial Healing Circle model, we form dyads or pairs because some people don't want to talk in the circle, but they have an opportunity, as you just did, to share with someone next to you, someone with whom you're paired. And we also make sure that there's a difference. There's a difference in power, perceived power. There's a difference in gender. There's a difference in projected identity. and these people come together and they share and they get to know each other better. So those are ways to develop the connections. But I often say to people, and this is, I think, a spiritual thing, and we don't use that word in these kind of formal, settings, but a lot of what we've been talking about has to do with inspiration, it has to do with spirit, it has to do with our inner selves. And there's only, I learned early in my life that there may be the appearance of power, there may be the assignment of power and authority, but I'm always connected to the ultimate power. And I really try to convey that to the people that I communicate with. Tap into the ultimate power that lives and breathes within us, because it's there, and it gives us a different perception of who we really are.
This is so funny. An ultimate power that lives and breathes within us. I'd like to offer that it also breathes in, around, and through. So we're a vehicle that is directing something. Right? We're directing that energy, directing our voice, our expression of our experiences, right? And how they've impacted us. The reason community is important to me, and I'm getting to your question of like, how do we do this in spaces? I believe that form follows function. So let me go to the design thinking, right? Human-centered and design thinking. If form follows function, meaning the way you do something is based on what you want it to produce, then our job inside of organizations, based on my experience, is to curate the space to produce the kinds of results and experiences that support our vision. Our vision is an agreement. So our intention every day, when I go inside of Geo, it is to clarify the shared vision for what brings us together through our work. And curate a space, make the space amenable to the kind of interconnectedness that reveals as much of our collective genius as possible. Because I believe that within any room, a group of people represents some percentage of that ultimate power, and 100% of what the situation requires through our collective expression. In other words, in other words, and this is just coming through me too, so I'm listening too, like, whoa. I invite you to consider, what if it's true that anytime you're in a space with other people, that 100% of what the situation requires is contained within the group and collective genius. And our job, our challenge in conversation is to reveal it through our individual and collective expression. What we've just talked to you today about is the roadmap for doing that. You might be thinking, how? And that's because we've all been socialized to think like that. That's the knowing moving forward. That's the muscle we've been building over the years. I'm inviting you to consider what. Use the imagination to define the aspiration. What is it that we collectively want to experience right now? And then let's curate the spaces, create the structures inside of our institutions that align with that vision, that shared expression. If we keep people at the center, then our every action, our every resource investment is toward cultivating the experience for that individual to bring forth their highest expression. That's individual, right? Your experiences are all different. But once we bring them together, then the sum total is bigger than just the combination of those individual experiences.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll take this last question and then transition.
Great. I'm Lauren Forsch from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I came as a community activist and volunteer here to Upswell. So I'm interested in knowing, Sioux Falls and several cities in the state of South Dakota have a substantial immigrant and refugee population, especially for their size, who inherently have a sense of separation from their families, from their homes, their culture, and maybe now not how, but what can we do as a community to help decrease that sense of separation and also implement racial healing in our communities?
Thank you for bringing the voice of the refugee community and the immigrant community into this space. It is certainly right now the most acute, I believe, manifestation of contemporary belief in a hierarchy of human value. And it is certainly seen all over the globe. I think I'm going to talk about it holistically speaking. The first requirement is the safety and the security of anyone, right? So having a commitment to creating experiences where there is safety and security, whether it's the housing, the community, the opportunity for income, the connection to existing families who are moving from a place of welcome and love, as many of the religious tenets would say you're supposed to do, to welcome the stranger, you know. So I would say the first level of engagement is making sure that basic security needs are met. But while we're focusing on the immigrant, the refugee, the displaced person, I think someone has to do some work with the broader community to help expand the numbers of people who are willing to show up and be part of that work, right? Because there's so many myths right now that are being projected, so many false narratives about who refugees are, and it's the dominant airwaves in terms of, it's the political strategy is to create fear of the other. So there has to be an intentional expression of the truth of who these people are to the majority culture that is not a refugee, that is not an immigrant today, right? Is not a displaced person today, although almost all of us trace our lineage back to those experiences. So that would be, I think, the first thing. And then once, we are showing compassion and we are showing up and providing safe, secure engagement opportunities for communities as they come in, and then we can begin to connect the dots to the broader work of racial healing within the community. In methods, there are many methods. The one that we're going to model today for you, RX Racial Healing Method, but it's all about creating opportunities for connection. And I would say we don't have enough of the literature coming out fast enough to tell us the actual stories and case histories of communities that have welcomed refugees in and done so amazingly well. And there are those stories, from the East Coast to the upper Midwest to the Southwest, and we need to collect, if there's some funders in the room, fund somebody to begin to curate those stories and create a new narrative, not of the negativity and the lack, but of the positivity and the possibilities of the power of bringing diverse people together. So that's my initial response.
Wow, yes to that. And the only thing I can say is that, I started off as a community organizer in the South Bronx, right? 25 residents there had already been coming together to improve the conditions of their schools, their local school. What I learned from that experience is that building upon that, we were able to address housing conditions, disproportionality in the child welfare system as it impacted that community, and a series of other issues. What you're doing is actually what more people can do. Engaging those individuals who are otherwise seen as other, marginalized, excluded from the day-to-day of mainstream society in that context, invite them in, have the conversation, get an understanding of what they care about, what is their experience like, and continue to invite others into that conversation to establish another sense of kind of a smaller sense of community as we move toward changing the dynamic of that broader conversation. It's going to feel different as that voice is introduced into it, which is why I love what you said about doing the work with the broader community. It's the paradox again, right? I can't just focus on either or, because both are a part of the whole. So you're doing the work. It's important, I think, that we get out of the mindset of what jobs are available. Like, this can't just be racial equity while I'm on the clock. Okay? So there is a lifestyle element to this. And I'll just refer to it as a commitment to practice. Practice is what we are in a different way than what you are and what we talked about. But that's the only thing that separates us. We're more practiced, more intentionally repeating certain patterns over and over again. We just gave you all of the tricks, the blueprint for you to practice now. And I'm available to support any of you in your own practice, and looking forward to getting to connect with you.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue, because as we enter our last 20 minutes of this conversation, I'd like to bring it back to the organization, and so putting into practice that both and in terms of building a race equity culture. And so when Equity in the Center curated this space, what we were hoping to practice through this panel and then through the working sessions or the concurrent sessions for the rest of the day is encouraging those of you who've come into the space with us to practice the both and, to hold the tension between the embodiment that Marcus was talking about earlier and Christopher talked about also of this work. The feeling of this work and the energy which you shared with your neighbor, and the fact that we all work jobs in organizations where we have to make choices and make a plan. So I want to acknowledge that we're transitioning to some extent back to having a white dominant conversation about how to do the work of equity. And a white dominant process is not how to do the work of equity, but in my role, I have to acknowledge the reality of the situation, the organizational context in which we all exist. So I'm going to ask you to hold both of those things as we start to talk about, so what are some of the choices that I can make as a leader in an organization who wants to introduce this process? What are inflection points in race equity work? Considering the range of scenarios in which organizations and leaders enter this work, the crises, the shifts in the local context and community, and how the work increases in depth and complexity over time. So are there particular moments when the racial healing process is particularly important or helpful? And given those things, what are factors that leaders and organizations should consider when introducing racial healing circles to members of their teams, their community, members of their boards, as we move into this space of both and people are very uncomfortable with the feelings that underlie this work?
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go. That's the difference between giving a keynote and answering questions.
For sure.
I would say that there are so many inflection points and opportunities within organizations, right? I would start with being able to connect the dots between your organizational mission and the necessity for doing this work. Every organization has a mission. At the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, our founder said, do what you will with the money as long as it helps children, right? And implying children who needed help. So we looked at the demographics of the country, and clearly most of the children in America are children of color. And most of them are growing up in conditions where the obstacles that racial hierarchy presents will prevent them from succeeding, or could prevent them from succeeding. So our mission alignment was clear. And so I would say the first step is understand how the work of equity, if you will, aligns with your stated mission. The next step then is to create a culture within the organization where there is less fear and there is more trust. Now, that's where the Racial Healing Circle process can be helpful. Because as soon as you decide or express a racial equity mission, that's when all of the fragility, that's the term these days, the book is popularized at white fragility. That's when all of this nervousness starts to surface, right? And so it's at that point that you want to begin to bring together, and I really think you should start with your boards and with your executive leadership teams, because once you go down this road, there will be hiccups, and you want to make sure that somebody's not jumping over you, going to the board to try to sabotage what you're doing. And so you need to bring the board and the executive committees together, have them go through a racial healing experience so that they understand the basic premises, the basic ideas, and the complexity of the work, right? And it is complex, but you create a set of values that guide the work, so that's important. Oftentimes, a crisis opens the occasion for doing the work. Someone files a lawsuit about discrimination, or some crisis happens in the community, or you have a change in leadership. All of these are occasions where you need to build up this relationship stamina, this relationship muscle. So almost any occasion of change or transformation can lend itself to expanding your capacity in an organization to see yourselves in one another and to line up together to achieve the vision or the mission. I would bring this to closure by saying that we've talked a lot about the head and about thought and about consciousness, but the real driver of the human experience is the heart. This work is heart work. The heart really dictates to the brain. We kind of think it works the other way around, but at a physiological and biochemical and molecular level, it's really the heart that drives us. And so most of the diversity, equity, and inclusion era of work links back to the victories of the civil rights movement and the laws that were passed, and a lot of that work has been done to be in compliance with those laws. The field of emotional intelligence kind of grew up alongside that. They were like parallels, but they didn't come together. And in the racial healing work, we try to bring the emotional intelligence insight together with what we know about justice and the need for it, and that begins to be, more importantly, work from the heart as well as the head. A requirement for that, and this is where you get back to the self-awareness that Marcus really emphasized, in addition to knowing the self, there's a body of literature emerging now that's grounded, in a lot of research, which is the importance of self-compassion. Not only know ourselves, but really love ourselves. Because we can't give what we don't have. So I can't extend love to you if I don't love me. So self-compassion and that body of research is a very important prerequisite sort of understanding, and it's really part of what we're aiming for is greater self-compassion. The other principle that is important in the work is to be open to the experience of awe, A-W-E. When we stand in awe of a redwood tree or a mountain or an amazing human being or a newborn baby, something happens to the brain. And we create a space for receiving something new in those moments of awe and wonder. And so not only do you share your story with someone in a dyad, but you hear the stories of maybe 24 people in the circle. And by the time you've heard all those stories in response to a common prompt, you're actually often in awe of the complexity and the diversity and the power and the resilience and the agency of the human experience. And from there, you move forward in a much more gentle and positive relational experience.
This is such a privilege. Thank you for that. Building a race equity culture. So I'm going to give this to you in 5 bullets. I'm going to attempt to do that. The first bullet is, and these are all complementary. So again, the both end. Commit to a self-mastery practice. That means all of the stuff I was just talking about leading up to now. That individual, increasing your awareness, being intentional. I'm going to throw a couple of words in there. Does it sound familiar, Terrence? Be aspirational, right? As opposed to focusing on the things that are potential barriers and blockages, emphasize what's possible. Possibility over barriers. We want to be aware of those things. We want to focus and emphasize, direct our energy on the aspiration. What's the experience that we want to encounter now? Okay. We want to also be audacious. So sometimes we tell ourselves stories that sound something to the effect of, once I do this, then once this thing happens, then I'm gonna don't never come. Later. I'll get to that later. I mean, just do this thing first, and then that's us not honoring what's being revealed through experience. We're ignoring. So then we create cultures of ignorance. See what I'm saying? So we're going to create a race equity culture. Again, we got to be clear about language. So we want to be intentional in our language. That means when we say something like race equity culture, we define culture. Culture is our way of being. Equity is the outcome. It's the state that's not characterized by your identity, by some variable that's associated with how you identify. And race, as I said, is only one. But there are some constructs out here historically, because the racial equity analysis that undergirds all of this is rooted in acknowledging the historical and structural variables that influence our decision making and experiences. So we have to just acknowledge that that's the paradigm that's driving the matrix. So let's continue to acknowledge that as the context as we do these other things. Race, equity, culture. So we curate spaces that acknowledge that cycle on a regular basis and invite resources for the individuals inside of that organization to do all of the things that we talked about and show up in the ways that are more whole, not just in our heads, but acknowledging what's in our heart, what we feel, what is authentic to our expression, and identifying opportunities for those expressions to influence decision making. And so, as CEO, I'm the chief modeler of power sharing. It doesn't mean I have the final word, which I do. It means that I have the ultimate authority of creating as many pathways as possible for other people to enter into the conversation and influence our considerations for possibilities. So you've heard me say possibilities a couple of times. Another bullet is to be curious. Our curiosity, I love how you said it, Dr. Christopher, entering into conversations, relationships with curiosity opens up. You never ask a question and narrow a thing down. The question opens it. It's coming up with all these answers that narrow the possibilities. We're so smart. We narrow things down unintentionally and unnecessarily to a smaller set of possibilities that are actually available to us in any particular point in time. That can be demoralizing. There's so many of us who have different points of view that creating this open culture is creative. So lastly, I'll say inside of an institution, we need to make agreements. Agreements form the foundation of trust. Racial equity, transformation, change in general occurs at the speed of trust. Trust can be defined as the degree to which we find someone reliable, the extent to which someone has proven with consistency to follow through on their agreements. So we want to make agreements that allow us to follow through on them and then develop and cultivate trust in order to facilitate the speed of change. So what does an institutional agreement look like? A policy for HR. It looks like one of your employees on the line staff saying, here's my experience of the work. It would be great if I could work from home periodically and get some of this stuff done, or relax myself after those heavy days, those conferences, so then we can create a policy, which is an institutional agreement that in these particular circumstances, we'll make a flexible work schedule available to staff. That's a racial equity informed practice. That's not only available to your senior team, who's already making all the money in the organization. Now you want to be the only ones that can get something that feels like a sabbatical or a break away from the work. We all need that. So those types of agreements, policies. I would also offer, it's a simple thing, and I tried to make this as simple as and accessible as possible because we're trying to demystify all these things. Guide rails for a discussion. Every time you enter a conversation inside of an organization, the people in that room get to dictate the rules of engagement. Some people prefer a conversation start with naming your pronouns. That helps in acknowledging the different forms of identity within that space. And just that little bit of honoring someone's identity allows them to exercise their voice, which is their inherent power, and therefore contribute to that collective revelation, that collective genius that we talked about. So, guide rails for discussion, policy recommendations, entering with curiosity, being audacious, because if you just think about what's practical, then you negotiate down from there, not up. Audacity allows us to envision what else is possible, and then you negotiate from there, and you usually end up way outside of what was practical or considered practical before. And then lastly, commit to that self-mastery practice. Breathe, ground yourself, be present, honor your emotions by acknowledging them, and ask for the help and support that you need for ultimate well-being.
Thank you. You guys are on perfect time. So it's 11 o'clock, and I'm just going to share one more thing to bring us back to where we began with Dr. Weesey, and honoring where the circle process that we've been talking about began, which is in Indigenous culture. Marcus said at one point that if you're in an organization, like everything you need to know, all the genius is in the room. And so what I'm going to propose is that all the genius that we need, the alternate belief system that we seek is in the land. It has always been here. It's been here for millennia. And the narrative has been invisibilized. So everything you need is already here. And how do we honor without appropriating in that context? When we were doing the research for the race equity cycle back in 2017, we came to a point where we asked the question that Rito started with, so then what is the other thing? If white supremacy culture is so toxic and is killing us, so then what is the other thing? And we did some research, we talked to folks, and so Janine Komanote, who's a leader from the Native community, offered something called the 4 R's, and so I'm going to offer this to you. I shared this with some other colleagues last week when we had a similar conversation. So the American Indian Organization did a study of global indigenous culture and found that these 4 values were shared across cultures. The first is relationship, which we've talked a lot about. The second is resource, and what that means is there's no such thing as poverty. Everybody has access to and shares the resources. The third is reciprocity, so giving back to other humans. And the last is redistribution. So I offer that to you as something to consider as we seek to build what we don't yet know as Americans, modern Americans in this society, but that which has always been here and to which we need to return. So thank you to everyone to Dr. Bisi for starting us off, to Dr. Christopher and to Marcus for this morning's rich discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you.
So the morning sessions start at 11:15, and if you have any questions on where to go, Andrew is right here, Mark is at the back, Anna and other volunteers are outside at the desk. If you signed up for the Racial Healing Circle or want to be one of the 5 who get in without pre-registering, you want to go to Wilford A on the 3rd floor. Building a Race Equity Culture and Nonprofit and Philanthropic Organizations is in A4, and the other one is in A3.
Like, I gotta turn this off. Yeah, she was so friendly to me when she was